everybody, Chcolate here and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking to you guys about seam allowance. Whether you're sewing cosplay, apparel, quilting, or crafting, knowing and understanding what seam allowance is and how to use it properly is a fundamental aspect of sewing. In this video, I'm going to be explaining what seam allowance is, why it's important, how to know or determine what your seam allowance is, as well as how to sew it accurately. So let's go ahead and get started. Every piece of clothing you own has some sort of seam allowance. T-shirts, shorts, dresses, pants, and all other garments require seam allowances to be constructed. What is seam allowance? To get a proper understanding of what seam allowance is, first we have to break the word down so it's a bit easier to make sense of. In sewing, a seam joins one or more pieces of fabric with a row of stitches. The allowance is how much extra fabric is left after sewing the seam. So basically, the seam allowance itself is the extra fabric from the raw cut edge to the row of stitches sewn to create a seam. This extra fabric allows for the formation of all seams. Depending on what size seam allowance your pattern calls for will determine how narrow or wide that extra bit of fabric is. When sewing any project, the seam allowance is used as a guide that ensures whatever you are sewing maintains the correct fit and proper measurements throughout construction. All layers of fabric joined by a seam must line up evenly and have the same seam allowance on all of the pieces joined. Using different seam allowances throughout your project will result in uneven seams and your final product potentially being crooked or having an awkward fit. Why is seam allowance important? Well, first of all, a seam cannot exist without some form of seam allowance, so everything you sew will have it. Having no seam allowance means sewing your seams on the very edge of your fabric pieces, and that results in disaster. There is no integrity to the seam, your stitches come undone, and a lot of fraying occurs. The extra fabric that makes up the seam allowance is important for that and many other reasons too. It contributes to the look, durability, and overall longevity of your project. Using seam finishes on the seam allowance will reduce fraying and make your project look clean on the inside. Some examples of seam finishing techniques include zigzag stitching the edges, using pinking shears on the edges, or using an overlock stitch or serger. Seam allowance can also change how a garment hangs or how crisp a project looks once constructed. Trimming your seam allowance, notching convex curves or hills, clipping concave curves or valleys, and pressing out your seams will all have an impact on how your seams lay, and it'll help your project look more professional overall. Having adequate seam allowance is also important for tailoring and alterations because it makes it possible for certain changes to be done to a garment. For example, you may have a dress that fits perfectly everywhere, but it might be a bit tight in the bust, the waist, or the hips. If you have enough seam allowance to work with, you can let out those seams by sewing another row of stitches within the seam allowance. Then, just get your seam ripper and take out the section of the previous stitches you want removed. This will add a bit more room to those tight areas. How do I know what my seam allowance is? The most common seam allowances are 1/4 of an inch, 1/2 of an inch, and 5/8 of an inch. Always check your pattern directions and use the seam allowance that they instruct you to use. Most commercial patterns call for a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance in their instructions, and they'll note any changed seam allowances on the corresponding pattern pieces. If you make your own patterns, you can determine the seam allowance yourself. Determining how much seam allowance to leave relies heavily on these two factors: the type of fabric and the seam finish being used for your project. Since seam allowance can vary depending on the weight and weave structure of the fabric and what type of seam finish you choose, it's important to take these factors into consideration before you start your project. Lightweight fabrics typically have smaller seam allowances, usually not more than 1/2 inch, because smaller seam allowances help reduce bulk, which plays a key role in helping your garment lay nicely in the end. Heavyweight fabrics need a larger seam allowance for the sake of durability, but can always be trimmed down later to reduce bulk if needed. Medium weight fabrics usually work just fine with the classic 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, but some people opt for the 1/2 inch seam allowance simply because it's just as easy to work with and has the added benefit of being easier to measure. How do I get an accurate seam allowance? Accuracy is important on all levels, and it starts at basic seam allowances. Using the wrong seam allowance will result in your project being too big or too small. These are the 3 most common seam allowances. They may look similar, and you may think that that small amount doesn't make much of a difference. But when you consider that those slight measurement differences would affect each seam throughout your project, it really does have a big effect. To help get an accurate seam allowance and maintain it throughout the sewing process, check out these tips. Use the guide markers on your machine. Keeping the edge of your fabric lined up with the proper seam allowance measurements will ensure that all of your seams will end up fitting the way they were intended to. You can purchase a 1/4 of an inch presser foot that maintains that seam allowance when you line up the fabric edge with the right-hand edge of the presser foot when the needle is set to its standard position. You can also use a piecing foot, which has a clear plate with red measurement markings to help out. If your machine doesn't have guide markers, or you don't have a 1/4 of an inch presser foot or piecing foot, you can create your own guide with painter's tape. Don't use other tapes because they can leave a sticky residue, but painter's tape comes off cleanly and you can adjust or remove it when needed. Another option, especially for beginners, is to invest in a magnetic seam guide that lines up on the needle plate of your machine to create a raised guide that keeps your stitching straight and your seam allowances accurate. Though, do be aware that it's not recommended to use them on computerized machines, but as long as you keep the magnetic guide only on the needle plate of your machine and be sure to keep it away from the LCD screen and other electronic functions, you should be fine. Check your manual just in case. When I first started to teach myself how to sew in 2012, I really didn't comprehend the importance of seam allowances, and I was always very confused as to why my projects turned out less than perfect. Understanding seam allowances and their importance will help elevate your work so it comes out looking more polished and fitting the way it was intended to. I really hope this video helps you get a better understanding of seam allowance because I know that I sure learned a lot while researching it. Let me know in the comments below if there are any other sewing techniques, subjects, or challenges you would like me to cover in future videos, and feel free to subscribe for more cosplay, sewing, and DIY content. So yeah, until next time guys, I'll see you then!